Hello everyone and welcome to the Prince Magnum channel where hot rodding and romance do coexist. I'm your host Prince Magnum. Welcome once again to Off the Chain, and in this episode we're going to continue our walkthrough of the original Legend of Zelda that came out on the NES in 1986. Alright, if you've kept up with the channel and you're familiar with this series and have been watching this series for a good moment, you know that in the last episode we picked up the magic sword, not the master sword as some people might think it would say. In 1986, they hadn't quite gotten to where there was a master sword in the Legend of Zelda series. However, we will talk about a particular theory of mine. I've done a video on it, but we're going to take a closer look at that particular theory about the magic sword, the master sword, and all that other stuff at a later date. And this, of course, is actually going to be a big shout out to another friend of mine here on YouTube, T-Belly. Alright, so now as we continue forward, let me tell you all that since we're on our way to the 5th labyrinth, or level 5 as it's sometimes called, it wasn't until years later again that we heard the term dungeon in Legend of Zelda. If you would like to call it a dungeon, I mean, obviously for the purposes of history and all that other stuff, we won't do that very often here on the Prince Magnum channel during this walkthrough. So if you're joining us for the first time, I just wanted to kind of clarify that for you, that you won't hear the terms that you're used to. You will be using the older terms, but by all means feel comfortable to use the ones that you're more familiar with. Alright, now, since we're talking about the 5th labyrinth, there is an old story about myself and this particular game, the 5th labyrinth, and it dates all the way back to the 1980s. I guess you could say that you're about to get some Prince Magnum lore, okay, along with learning the walkthrough of this game and everything like that. All right. Back in the 1980s, it was a different time, okay? And I know a lot of times, some of you younger folks, I couldn't talk there for a second. Some of you younger folks out there, like, oh, the 80s was a great time, and it was a great time. It was a great time to be a kid. The cartoons were great. The music was great. The video games were great. However, not everything was exactly ooh la la compared to today. And let me explain what I mean by that. Back in the 1980s, there was internet. It's just not the internet we would think of today. It was what we called Telnet. Now, with Telnet, if you want to see what that looked like, look at the particular movies Weird Science or War Games. Very good examples. Basically, it'll look like someone takes their old phone off of the receiver and puts it on something that looks kind of like another receiver that's hooked into their computer, and of course, then that hooks them to the to Telnet. And for the record, for those that have not watched the Polybius video, Telnet was invented by our military as a way to send messages and things like that. So that was early form of email and chat and all that other stuff like that. And you could even play chess on it. But the information like we're used to today was just not, that was beyond the capabilities of Telnet. So it wasn't until, years later that we would have that information available, obviously, by the mid to late 90s. Now, that being said, back in the 1980s, if you wanted to get that information on a particular video game, so you had this is Nintendo we're talking. You needed Nintendo Power. So back in the 1980s, where I lived, a lot of families could not afford Nintendo Power. As a matter of fact, where I lived, a lot of families couldn't afford an NES. A lot of families still had, by the time that this game was brand new, still had the Atari 2600. And this is the irony of it. My parents could not afford Nintendo Power. And when I picked this game up for the first time, it was a rental. So I didn't have but maybe a couple of days to try to figure out how to get through. And it wasn't going to be until years later that I would have my own copy. And of course, by this time, the Super NES is now on the shelf. So, bear all this in mind. After we beat the first labyrinth, and I'm looking at this game for the first time, one of the first times, so now we're in, the next labyrinth we found is right here. I had only the bow, and I only had, the candle, the boomerang. I didn't have the raft, or I didn't have the ladder, because those are in the labyrinths that come before. So I only had the first one, and all of a sudden we find the fifth one. So as far as we could get is to this room right here. Without the ladder, you can't cross that spot just like that. So imagine it's the 1980s, and you're looking at this game, you're trying to figure it out, trying to beat it. That's as far as we got, my younger brother and I. My dad, who could not, is actually a retired firefighter for up there around Baldwin, Missouri. For him, he's like, okay, I'm going to figure out this so my kids can beat this game. He never figured it out until years later. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So it's the 1980s. My dad can't afford Nintendo Power. My mom was actually a high school dropout. And so she didn't have, couldn't find those, great career jobs, because that's kind of how it was in the 1980s. So kids stay in school. And the reason why mom had to drop out is because in the 1970s, when she was pregnant with me, being my mom and dad's oldest, if that happened, the guy, if he was still in school, he had to drop out of school and go to work immediately. And if the woman was in school, she had to drop out and start thinking about becoming a mom. That was how it was back then. So my mom never got her high school diploma. And so, my dad being a full-time firefighter, my mom worked whatever job she could really get her hands on. We didn't have a whole lot in the way of money and could not afford that subscription to Nintendo Power. So we never knew, I never actually got past that one room until years later. Now, again, it's the 1980s, and everybody's playing this game. Everybody's playing Legend of Zelda. And by the time I had the opportunity to pick it up, it was 1986-87. So by the time that I'm really getting a good look at this particular game and that sort of thing, let me also say that along with that, everybody's playing it. Well, in 87, we all know Legend of Zelda 2 comes out, so sometimes kids would get confused between the two. And imagine trying to get that information in the 1980s on the schoolyard, elementary school. You can imagine how frustrating this was, because I was not getting the information to get past the fifth labyrinth. So, that being said now, this was very, very, frustrating for myself and my little brother, because we just couldn't get past that one room. Why can't we get past that one room? If we could get past that one room, we could probably get that sword that was up near that waterfall. You could see where this is going. My dad actually himself would sometimes stay up in the middle of the night trying to figure out so his kids could get past that room. My mom wasn't really into video games, so for her, this wasn't, the kids will figure it out eventually. That sort of thing. So now that we've discussed that, it wasn't until I was like 12 years old, and this is like 1992, and I had my own copy, that I had an uncle who actually showed me what I was doing wrong. And had I been a patient kid and looked at that upper corner, I would have noticed that it would have said level 5. I don't ever remember that. But if I'd have looked at that and, maybe I need to go out and find, find the, where I'm supposed to be. And if I can find out where I'm supposed to be, then, you can see where this is going. Then I can get that, no. I hadn't even found level 2, hadn't found level 3, hadn't found level 4, so here I am in level 5, and that's why I couldn't get past this spot, okay, that one room. That's why I couldn't get past it. And, it wasn't until I was 12 years old before I learned what I was doing wrong. So, my dad, because in 91, my parents actually split up and got a divorce and all that other stuff, like we're all very familiar with, but it was brand new in the 1980s and 1990s. It was a brand new thing where parents were getting divorced. My dad, I didn't find out till years later that my dad sat down with this game for many years, and it wasn't until, tried to figure it out. It wasn't until I was 16 years old when I got to show my dad what was beyond that room. So in the end, it was a happy ending, because years later I said, Dad, I see you got a copy of Legend of Zelda. Do you remember that one area that we just couldn't get past? And he said, yes. I said, sit down, I've got something to show you. So my dad, who was a firefighter, could never afford, the subscription to Nintendo Power and all the other stuff that we're very familiar with today. All of those problems that, I guess you could say, first world problems of a 1980s child, eventually got solved. It had the happy ending, but before we could have the happy ending, you had to have a lot of frustration. I know for some of you out there, it's like, well, it's it's a video game. Yeah, and I'll agree with you, but for a kid in the 1980s, not being able to tell his buddies that he beat Legend of Zelda, and when everybody else had, that had to be frustrating, and all the ones that usually had Nintendo Power or had a friend who had the Nintendo Power magazine. So, there you have it. Eventually it was a happy ending, but there had to be a little bit of heartbreak in the time, in that meantime, that frustration. It wasn't until I was 12, and it was actually an uncle who isn't with us anymore, who was about 4 years older than me, who showed me what I was doing wrong. And of course, wherever he's at, even though he's no longer with us, wherever he's at, thank you, Uncle, for showing me how to beat Legend of Zelda. And it was, again, long after the schoolyard days. So there's a little bit of a backstory if you were ever curious. I guess you could say if you were ever wondering what it was like to be a kid in the 1980s, on the schoolyard, there was a lot of this. And, again, for anybody who loves video games and enjoys the retro games like we do here on the Prince Magnum channel, there's a little bit of retro history to go along with the games. So, there you have that. Alright folks, now if you've stayed with me this long, thank goodness. It had to be story time, right? Okay, let's actually talk about the walkthrough itself. In this particular labyrinth, we did a couple of things already. Number one, we picked up the whistle. The whistle is going to be very important with this particular boss. So, what do I mean by that? Well, you'll see soon enough. And the whistle will be crucial, I say, in uncovering the 7th labyrinth, which will be later. Okay. Now, something else that we picked up is we picked up the capability of carrying more bombs. Now, up until that moment, we spent 100 rupees in this particular labyrinth. You can only carry 8. Now we can carry 12. So this is going to be very helpful because this dungeon, we're going to start seeing dungeons start getting very cryptic, more so than in the earlier ones. It's just going to get a lot more cryptic from here, okay? And again, it is Legend of Zelda. That should not surprise you that there's a lot of cryptic puzzles and maze-like sort of stuff, and as we continue, what was once a boss is now just a demi-boss, and blah, 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 blah. You guys get the idea, okay? So, now that we've discussed that, let me also talk about what is known as Pole's Voice in this particular game. Now, if you're not familiar with Pole's Voice is those rabbit-looking heads. Now, I did not know this, but when this game came out on the Famicom, there was on the second controller there was like a microphone, okay, and I guess it never really fully dawned on myself or a lot of the other kids when we picked up the manual. It said that Pole's Voice did not like loud noises, and if you had the Japanese version of this game, the Famicom, on the Famicom, this was important because that microphone on the second controller, you would say something in it and Pole's voice would die, that little, But when it gets over here to the United States on the, on the NES, we don't have that little microphone. So how do you take them out? Well, they left that translation in there, and the quickest way to take them out is with an arrow from your bow. And it'll go through several of them all at once. Now, some of us kind of had this theory that because the bow makes this sound, that was the sound that he didn't like. It was a loud, high-pitched sound, kind of like a dog whistle, I guess you could say. And to us, that was what killed him. Some of us never fully figured that out, what the loud voice was. Some of us, having the typical mind of a child, you got to remember, this is the 1980s, again, that we're discussing. And when you're starting to talk about the 1980s, video games like this, you had to have a lot of imagination. And that's what our imagination told us, was that sound was a high-pitched sound, like you would think with a dog whistle. And that was what Pole's Voice, those little rabbit-looking heads that you see in this room right now, did not like. And so when the arrow hit him, that was the end, and that was our logic in the 1980s. So if you thought that was interesting, again, if you look in the manual, it'll actually say that Pole's Voice does not like loud noises. And little did we know until years later, many of us kids, that was just something that was left in from the Famicom version of this game from Japan, and we didn't, some of us didn't ever fully understood that, but some of us, that's what we figured. Okay, so it's something you might find interesting about this game. All right, so now at this point, we have everything that we need. We are onward and upward, heading towards the boss, heading towards that. That all-important 5th Triforce piece. Now, again, you have to collect 8 pieces of the Triforce, and then you can go into the 9th Labyrinth and take on Ganon and rescue Princess Zelda. Now, let me also say very quickly that if you've never played this game before, maybe you're looking at it for the first time, what have you, let me also say that this particular game, you can go into the 9th Labyrinth long before, but you cannot get past, the guard, I guess you could say, in this particular case, unless you have the full 8 pieces of the Triforce. So, and Link you'll see that as this walkthrough progresses. Now, real quick, I just beat the boss. You need the whistle. He shrinks down to a smaller size, makes it easier for you to kill. And then, of course, if you did what I just did, this is kind of like that gamer's trap that some people talk about, a gamer's trap of sorts. Basically, you go down there and you're locked in this room, so if you're low on health, you're in trouble. So don't fall for that, okay? You can skip that room. You don't need it. So, but I actually did that. I do remember that, and thought I would show you guys that particular trap. Now, fifth labyrinth done. Let's leave. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. Okay, you're going to go down, and then you reach this spot, and you just go down again. No, you don't. For whatever reason, the game will not allow you to do that. So you have to go this way. You can't go any other way but this way. Okay? So, that was also another early gamer's trap. You would come out, you would go to leave, and you just keep going down. I mean, logic would suggest that you would go down and go to another part. No. This is Legend of Zelda, and as cryptic as a mother, you get the idea. So you can't do that. So the best thing that you're going to have to do is, ta-da, you're going to have to go this way, and of course dodging the rocks and everything else. It is just one of those things, all right? So, now that we have completed the fifth labyrinth and told you a lot of history about that labyrinth with myself and early days of playing this game in the 1980s, well into the 90s, all the way up until 1996. Now that we've done that, in the next episode, we're going to take a look at going to the sixth labyrinth. I know in previous videos we used the original save function. For the record, I'm actually doing this on a Nintendo Switch, but for the purposes of nostalgia, I have been using the original game save feature. But we won't be doing that in this particular episode. All right. So that brings us to our usual spot. All right. Again, shout outs as usual at the end of the video, like always. So just look for them at the end. As usual, for all of you out there, smash the like button, smash the subscribe button if you haven't, hit that bell icon, and as always, get out there and work on a project. I don't care what it is. Just do something with yourself. Remember, idle hands and a creative mind go together like oil and water. If you have a sweetheart, sweep her off her feet. Do something special for her today. And as always, for all of you out there, if no one out there has told any of you that they love you today, Prince Magnum does. God bless you and have a happy 24. Thank you.
Man. Wow, man, freak